What you see now is not reality. Of course, you know that. You could easily point to many of the differences between this video recording and your reality. This recording is constrained to fit within a certain number of pixels, a limited number of colors. There are many other technological limitations. This recording took place some time ago, and it took place in your reality, but the recording you're looking at now is not reality. Of course, your screen exists in reality, and in that sense, you are experiencing reality right now, but the images that you see on your screen are merely a distorted, symbolic representation of reality. I can withhold information, I can deceive you, I can stay hidden out of frame.
Or I can reveal myself. This is chess. Chess is a game. It has a set of rules, a set number of pieces, a specific board. If you change the rules or the number of pieces of the board, it becomes something other than the game of chess. In reality, the universe which we all share is not unlike the game of chess. As Thomas Huxley said, the board is the world, the pieces are the phenomena of the universe, the rules are what we call the laws of nature. And yes, I did recently watch The Queen's Gambit. We aren't even close to fully understanding the rules of our world, but we know that they exist. We know that there are principles which reliably govern the motion of planets and galaxies and molecules and subatomic particles and everything that makes up our reality. Since the ancient times, humans have tried to comprehend the nature of reality. Is our reality merely an illusion, a hallucination which we all share, as Buddhism teaches? Is reality a creative process in which we are all connected, as we read in the Tao? Are there essential forms of all things which physical forms can never quite encapsulate, as Plato speculated? These are all questions of ontology, the study of the nature of reality. During the European Renaissance, scientific inquiry was advancing so rapidly that the well-established ontological conceptions of the universe, which had been accepted since ancient times, were beginning to unravel. Groundbreaking discoveries like Galileo's proof that the Earth revolved around the sun were upsetting the established order of things. Powerful institutions like monarchies and the church did their best to restrain such progress. Reordering ontological understanding was painful and met much resistance, but ultimately, those new ideas could not be contained. One of the first Europeans to begin incorporating this new era of enlightenment into an organized ontological system was René Descartes.
During the 17th century, he formulated his famous first principle.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Whoa. You see, Descartes realized that the senses sometimes failed him, deceived him, and in that sense, reality as we perceive it seemed unreliable to Descartes. But Descartes realized that he could reason, he could think and question and doubt, and even by doubting his own existence, he knew for certain that he himself did exist because some entity had to be doing that doubting. In that sense, Descartes was an idealist. He came to believe that the only reliable experience of reality occurs within our human consciousness, within the mind. Descartes believed that knowledge must be logically teased out from the general to the specific through the process of deductive reasoning. First, we must establish irrefutable and broad first principles like I think, therefore I am, and from there we can deduce more specific conclusions about reality. About a century later in the 1700s, David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, took the opposite position materialism. Hume held that the only meaningful and reliable reality is the one we can observe and measure with our senses. Hume broke new ground on the philosophy of empiricism, or empirical materialism, the belief that only our senses can provide us real, meaningful information about the world.
As Hume puts it, causes and effects are discoverable not by reason, but by experience.
According to empiricism, the human mind is incapable of reasoning out the truth about our world. The only way to discover truth is to perceive, to witness, to measure and observe material reality. In this sense, Hume's version of hard empiricism is inductive. We begin by making specific measurements and observations. We take data and then we look for patterns, and then we work towards more general conclusions. So Hume was hella skeptical. He questioned the very notion of cause and effect, and he felt it would never be possible for humanity to have a complete understanding of our world. According to Hume, humans can't prove that reality will keep working in the way we've been seeing it working up until now. There's no way to be certain that any minute now, gravity, for instance, might simply stop working. The rules of the game might change suddenly at any moment, according to Hume, and so the only things we can really be sure of are the things that we can observe in the here and now. A bit later, a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant tried to tackle Hume's radical skepticism. He wanted to develop a scientific form of philosophy that would allow us to know what we know. Now, a fancy word for this endeavor is epistemology, the study of knowledge. Kant believed that humanity needed to know how we can know what we know before we can begin tackling those deeper questions about the nature of reality. Like Hume, Kant was skeptical of the dogmatic metaphysics of the ancient world. He didn't believe we could simply comprehend objects and people and the nature of reality using common sense. Kant determined that our understanding of reality is constrained by the very nature of our consciousness. To Kant, science can't tell us the true nature of the universe, the true nature of reality. It can only tell us how reality can appear to our human consciousness. Kant's exploration of the conscious perception of reality set off a firestorm of philosophy in Germany, which came to be called German idealism. Philosophers such as Johann Fichte, Friedrich Schilling, Arthur Schopenhauer, and many others continue to speculate, debate, and examine the nature of consciousness and reality in their works. And one German idealist with 4 names, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, pulled all of these ideas together into a groundbreaking system of thought called absolute idealism. Hegel used dialectics, an ancient method of analyzing the world through a sort of dialogue between conflicting forces and ideas to develop his philosophy. Now, the dialectic consists of 3 steps. First, a thesis is introduced, a new idea or force. This thesis is met by an antithesis, an antithesis, an opposing idea or force. And eventually, the thesis and antithesis form a synthesis, and we call the formation of this synthesis negation, because the original thesis is negated into the synthesis by the interaction with the antithesis. In this model, all things are connected, all things affect each other dynamically. Everything is constantly changing. All things are constantly in the process of negating from one form to another. Once negation occurs, the synthesis becomes a new thesis, which will then be met by a new antithesis. And the negation will thus eventually itself be negated. We will have a negation of the negation. The important thing to understand is that Hegel saw this as a progressive process, striving toward an ultimate purpose. The dialectics of our universe in Hegel's mind negate in a definite direction, always advancing forward with a purpose, with an objective. And what is that objective? Well, Hegel came to believe that humanity is collectively pursuing an understanding of absolute truth, a singular, universal understanding which, once we discover it, would unify all thoughts and understanding together. According to Hegel, humanity has been collectively advancing through stages of understanding throughout history, and someday, through the process of dialectical conflict and negation, humanity will arrive at this state of absolute truth. And it'll be super cool when we get there, according to Hegel. Hegel was an idealist, but he knew that there was a material reality outside of our consciousness. He believed that the only way for us to conceive of this material reality was through our consciousness. And so he believed conscious thought was the dialectical engine that would bring us eventually to absolute understanding of the absolute truth.
Hegel died in 1831, and in the ensuing decade, a group of German philosophers deemed by history as the young Hegelians emerged, developing ideas on top of Hegel's monumental philosophical system. The young Hegelians built their ideas on Hegel's system of philosophy, but they also challenged his philosophy in their own diverging directions. Max Stirner developed egoism, which puts the individual ego in a place of central importance in philosophy. Ludwig Feuerbach developed a bombastic philosophy outlining a divine purpose for humanity. Bruno Bauer, who had studied directly under Hegel, developed a free-thinking atheistic philosophy of self-consciousness.
What unified these young Hegelians was that all of them built their philosophies on the foundations of Hegelian idealism. All of them, that is, except for these two fellas.
Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were heavily influenced by Hegel, just like their young Hegelian peers, but they were sharply distinguished from the other young Hegelians by their fundamental break with idealism. Marx and Engels saw dialectics as a useful system for comprehending reality, but unlike Hegel, they did not believe that truth flowed only from what we could find and reason out in our consciousness. Like David Hume, they were materialists. So Marx and Engels saw the material, physical world as the first basis for our reality and believed that our conscious thoughts follow from our material conditions. So Marx and Engels took Hegel's system of idealist dialectics and combined it with materialism to develop their new system of dialectical materialism. In developing dialectical materialism, Marx sought to demystify the system which Hegel had developed, writing, "My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but it is its direct opposite." According to Hegel, the human brain, through the process of thinking, transforms into an independent subject, creating our experience of the real world. And the real world is thus only an external phenomena of human consciousness. It's not that Hegel believed that the human mind created the world, but that what we experience as the world is created in the mind.
Does that make sense? Basically, there's this external world all around us, but we can't experience it directly. We can only experience a version of it which is created by and within our mind, our consciousness. According to Hegel, the human mind and the process of thought are independent of this external reality, which Marx dismissed as mysticism. As Marx says, "With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought." Marx didn't see dialectics as a mystical engine of reality unfolding towards some absolute truth like Hegel did. Instead, he simply saw dialectics as a system that was suitable for describing and analyzing complicated systems in a way that could be easily processed by the human mind.
Engels described the great basic thought of dialectical materialism this way: "The world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which the things apparently stable, the concepts, go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away." This perspective sees everything in existence as constantly undergoing change. It sees reality as a complex and dynamic system in which different forces are always acting on one another. Now, Marx had a major problem with the form of materialism that was popular in his day, which was based on Hume's empiricism. It was also known as positivism. To Marx, that kind of hard empiricism focused too much on the source of knowledge, our senses, and completely ignored the form of knowledge, our thoughts and our ideas and our thought structures. Now, Marx believed that Hume's hard empirical materialism had roughly the same flaw as idealism. That is to say, a lack of a connection between the material and the ideal. The idealist dismissed all sense data as unreliable and relied exclusively on inductive reasoning and consciousness, whereas the empiricist dismissed conscious thought to focus solely on what could be sensed. Dialectical materialism bridged this gap, taking into account the transition from the material world which we sense to the ideal world of our consciousness. Now let's take a brief detour to discuss the scientific methods which have gradually formed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries and continue to evolve today. Scientific methods attempt to blend deductive and inductive reasoning together to verify facts about reality as concretely as possible, which dialectical materialism also attempts to do, but we'll get to that later. Now, there are many different scientific methodologies in use today, but they all follow a general pattern. They typically begin with a hypothesis, an educated guess about what might happen in a given set of circumstances. This hypothesis is then tested through experimentation and careful observation, and then conclusions are drawn from the experiment's results. A common criticism of dialectical materialism is that it's somehow opposed to scientific methods used by scientists today, but this has never been the case. Marx and Engels did not see dialectical materialism as a replacement for or in conflict with scientific methods of inquiry. They actually trusted the data and observations that were made through scientific methods, and they used that data as evidence in their own works. Marx and Engels simply saw dialectical materialism as a way of describing and analyzing the dynamics in our world which cause all things to undergo constant change, but never in opposition to conclusions that are drawn from scientific experimentation and observation. Dialectical materialism is simply a way of looking at a large, complicated system from every angle, using both deductive and inductive reasoning to consider every aspect of a process or a system rooted in data which has been observed, which has been derived from scientific methods. Both scientific methods and dialectical materialism were developed in opposition to idealism, but also against the older form of positivist and empirical materialism, which had been pioneered by David Hume, which considered only things which could be measured and observed with our senses as real and meaningful. Both scientific methods and dialectical materialism have thus been used in the soft sciences, such as psychology and sociology, to study processes and systems which can't be physically measured, such as the processes of consciousness. And dialectical materialism relies on scientifically generated data to understand the dynamic processes that shape our world. There is no conflict between scientific methods and dialectical materialism. They can live in harmony. Marx reasoned that the material world existed before the ideal. The world we inhabit existed before the human mind. And likewise, the material precedes and shapes the ideal. Though, of course, our thoughts and ideas can also be translated through our activities into shaping the material world. If you think it, you can, perhaps, possibly, do it, according to Marx. According to dialectical materialism, when we sense something in the real world, we have a resulting thought, a concept of what we have sensed. Marx and Engels believed that all science was a process of organizing and analyzing these concepts, these sense experiences of the real world. Dialectical materialism is not anti-science, and it's not meant as a replacement for scientific methods. On the contrary, Marx and Engels recognized the extraordinary breakthroughs in understanding our material world which scientific methods delivered, and they built on them. Dialectical materialism, then, is a way of making sense of the complicated systems and processes of change that surround us all, and of sorting and organizing and analyzing data that is generated through scientific methods. Marx and Engels rejected the idea that there was any absolute truth, as Hegel had claimed. And they pointed out that every branch of science continues to develop and change and evolve. Even the pure, hard sciences, such as mathematics and physics, seem to be continually developing with no end in sight. So, in short, dialectical materialism describes human beings as living in a material world in which all things are constantly changing and developing, and in which our ideas are also constantly changing and developing. And according to this philosophy, the material world is connected to the ideal world of our consciousness, and material conditions shape our minds and our consciousness, just as our minds can bring about changes in the material world. It's a continuity, baby! To some extent, Marx and Engels agreed with Hume that thoughts and ideas could be unreliable. But they believed that our ideologies, the systems of interlocking ideas which shape our understanding of the world, could, with careful work, come ever closer over time to reflecting the material world, and that this is the work of science. Unfortunately, our ideological conceptions can be deeply flawed. It's entirely possible, indeed it's very common, for humans to have what Engels described as false consciousness. Human beings are more than capable of imagining
false motivations for actions and events. We can have misunderstandings and misinterpretations of reality. Our ideology can be woefully out of sync with the material world. And so the work of science is the work of aligning our ideology with our material world. But this work is complicated by many barriers that make it difficult to perceive the material world with any accuracy, not the least of which is the very vehicle I'm using right now to deliver this information to you. A system which human beings cannot escape, a system which unavoidably tears us away from a direct understanding of truth and reality. YouTube. No, wait, not YouTube. Language. Language is how we human beings consciously think about our world. That much should be pretty obvious. Whenever you have a conscious thought, it's in your human language. But what about those deeper thoughts, those feelings and emotions and imaginings which do not fully form into language? I'm referring, of course, to the unconscious. The term unconscious was coined by German idealist philosopher Friedrich Schilling, but the term was popularized by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was an idealist in his own right, and his ideas have today been mostly dismissed by the field of psychology. But in the 20th century, a French psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan saw value in Freud's psychoanalytical methods and sought to adapt them into a more scientifically sound system. Lacan accepted Freud's basic definition of the unconscious as thought which goes unnoticed, activities of the mind that do not surface in our spoken language. But Lacan developed the idea of the unconscious in one very important way. He argued that unconsciousness itself is structured like a language. That's not to say that the unconscious is a language. Obviously, you can't speak unconscious, but according to Lacan, our unconscious thoughts are structured in a symbolic system which has the same basic subject-verb-object structure of spoken human language. Lacan used the example of a crying baby. Babies have not yet developed the ability to speak, but when they cry, they are communicating without spoken language a need. There is in the crying baby a subject, the baby, a verb, the need, and an object, whatever it is the baby desires. The parent must then, through an act of linguistic reverse engineering, figure out what the baby wants by offering different objects, until the baby responds by communicating that yes, this is the object the baby wanted. This is a remarkable observation. In this manner, the unconscious is what Lacan deemed trans-individual. We all have the same unconscious language, the same language-structured unconscious forms. Perhaps we even share these forms with animals. A dog or a cat can certainly signal to us and communicate with us just as a baby can, using these symbolic unconscious structures. Internally, each and every one of us shares the same language-structured unconsciousness experience, and that strikes me as a powerful bond which we all share. But there's also something kind of weird and terrifying about Lacan's notion that the unconscious is structured like a language. If our conscious thoughts are structured like language and our unconscious thoughts are also structured like language, well, that means that all of our thoughts are structured like language, but reality is not structured like language. This ocean behind me is not structured like a language. The ocean does not verb. The ocean is only a subject or an object in our minds. Objects like the ocean merely exist. Things happen. Reality is in a way that is fundamentally not structured like a language. All of this is to say that if Lacan is correct, then the system we use to experience and contemplate this ocean, to experience and contemplate reality, is fundamentally not reflective of reality. We are decoupled from the material world in a way that is seemingly and completely unavoidable. Slavoj Zizek is a Slovenian philosopher and the first thinker we're discussing here who is alive today, at least as of the moment of recording. A doctor of psychoanalysis, Zizek has extrapolated from Lacan's conception of the unconscious some striking political observations. But before we can get to those observations, we must first take a step back in time to fascist Italy.
In 1926, after an attempted assassination of Mussolini, the fascist government enacted emergency laws which were used as a justification to imprison Antonio Gramsci, who was then head of the Italian Communist Party. For over a decade, Gramsci, who had numerous health problems, suffered in prison until he was released to die in 1937 at the age of 46. But through all of that time in confinement, Gramsci wrote extensively, filling more than 30 notebooks with his ideas on history, philosophy, politics, and art. Gramsci was forced to use code words and euphemisms in much of his writing due to censorship, and he lacked access to a library for research, but the resulting works still had remarkable clarity and accuracy given the circumstances. One of Gramsci's most important contributions was his conception of cultural hegemony. Philosophers and political thinkers had long known and discussed the role of culture, religion, and other social forces in the structures of political economies, or rather, the superstructure. You see, Marx himself described a relationship between the structure and the superstructure of society, the material and the ideal. The structure, according to Marx, involved the material and economic system, the organization and distribution of the means of production. The superstructure constituted the ideal, cultural institutions, attitudes, philosophies, and what Gramsci called civil society. Just as the material world precedes and drives the ideal, Marx believed that the material structure of society supersedes the superstructural ideal of society. And so Marx said that the primary emphasis of political activity should be focused on changing the material structure of society, seizing the means of production, ending the material structure of capitalism. Are you with me? Marx believed the end of capitalism was inevitable because he believed the contradictions of the structure of capitalist society were building up far too rapidly to be sustained. But by the time Gramsci was writing, capitalism seemed stronger than ever, contradicting Marx's bold predictions. Fascism had emerged as a new and frightening force which could viciously and rapidly undo any progress made by the left and preserve the capitalist mode of production. And of course, Gramsci understood this very well from the vantage point of his prison cell, which he occupied for the crime of being a communist. In seeking to understand why and how capitalism had survived and strengthened since Marx's days, Gramsci studied the cultural superstructure of capitalist society. Gramsci came to the conclusion that the capitalist class uses cultural and social norms and institutions as powerful weapons to reinforce their position in our society. In other words, regular people in capitalist society had become indoctrinated by capitalist cultural hegemony so deeply and so subtly that they took it for granted without even knowing that they'd been indoctrinated to begin with. Gramsci argued that it would be impossible to have a successful revolution against capitalism without first making great strides in countering and undermining capitalist cultural hegemony. He argued that a war of maneuver against the ruling class could only have lasting success if it was preceded by a war of position to change the ideas and the beliefs and the culture of the population, to create a counter-hegemony to dialectically challenge the dominant hegemony.
Gramsci pointed out that one of the reasons the Russians had had success in their 1917 communist revolution while European communists had failed was that European cultural hegemony was far stronger than that of the Russian Tsar. In the East, the state was everything. Civil society was primordial and gelatinous. In the West, there was a proper relation between state and civil society, and when the state tottered, a sturdy structure of civil society was immediately revealed. The state was just a forward trench. Behind it stood a succession of sturdy fortresses and emplacements.
In other words, the cultural hegemony of capitalism was so strong in Europe and North America that capitalism itself could not be challenged until the hegemonic superstructure was sufficiently challenged and supplanted by a prevailing counter-hegemony. So with this concept of cultural hegemony in mind, let us return now to Slavoj Zizek. Like Gramsci, Zizek believes that capitalist ideological hegemony is so thoroughly set within our unconscious in modern society that most of us have no idea that we even have any ideology at all. And this is the reason that neoliberal politicians like Tony Blair are able to say with a straight face that we live in a post-ideological society. Because most of us truly believe that we have no ideology at all, that the beliefs we hold are common sense or neutral, totally irrefutable. Zizek frequently cites a very commonly held belief that there is no possible alternative to capitalism as evidence of the power of ideology in our lives and in our minds. Of course, there are alternatives to capitalism, but so many people are so indoctrinated by capitalist hegemony that they don't even think that their positions are ideological in nature. Most people believe they're being neutral and objective when they say capitalism is the best system, the only system that will work for society, that there are no alternatives and none should be explored. Zizek's most well-known metaphor for this unwitting immersion in ideology is based on the film They Live by John Carpenter. In that film, a man discovers that the human race is being secretly controlled by aliens from outer space. When he puts on a pair of sunglasses, he can see things as they really are. And Zizek argues that this is a great metaphor because the glasses must be put on in order to see the true nature of ideology. It takes work, it takes effort. It's not a matter of taking the glasses off. You have to take the effort, perform the action, do the work of putting the glasses on to see the nature of ideology. It takes work and effort because the default position is complete obliviousness. Without the glasses, we see nothing. So, broadly speaking, Zizek believes that seeking a deep theoretical understanding of ideology is a prerequisite to understanding and engaging with the world around us. It would be impossible to dismantle the hegemonic ideology of capitalism from within our own minds if we're not even aware of how ideology functions within our minds to begin with. So, how does hegemony function? What are the ways in which capitalism sculpts and shapes our culture and our ideology, our very minds, without our even knowing?
George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm in 1984, described some of the ways in which hegemonic control was maintained in England in the mid-20th century. Unpopular ideas can be silenced and inconvenient facts kept dark without the need for any official ban. The British press is extremely centralized, and most of it is owned by wealthy men who have every motive to be dishonest on certain important topics. At any given moment, there is an orthodoxy, a body of ideas which it is assumed that all right-thinking people will accept without question. It is not exactly forbidden to say this, that, or the other, but it is not done to say it, just as in mid-Victorian times it was not done to mention trousers in the presence of a lady. Anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness. A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing, either in the popular press or in the highbrow periodicals.
Decades later, in his book Manufacturing Consent, anarchist scholar and philosopher Noam Chomsky outlined in great detail all the ways in which the media controls the narratives and information that heavily influence our ideology in unofficial yet far-reaching ways. Chomsky described a propaganda model of capitalism which forced all information to pass through 5 filters before anything could make it to publication and broadcast in the mass media.
Media platforms and outlets are owned by capitalists. They are generally supported by advertising from capitalists. They source information from institutions which receive funding from capitalists and the capitalist-influenced state. They face flack from corporation-owned organizations which generate negative responses to anything that goes against the grain of hegemony, and they exploit fear in entities deemed a threat to the hegemony.
And as Zizek points out, seeing and recognizing the hegemonic ideology that surrounds us is a painful process. Most of us do not want to admit that we are under the sway of any ideology, and this makes resisting and undermining the ruling hegemonic ideology extremely difficult. Capitalist institutions make this even more difficult as the media generates misinformation and grand lies about capitalism lifting people from poverty and conflating capitalism with democracy and reinforcing the common sense notion that there's no alternative to capitalism in subtle and clever and insidious ways. In a sense, these capitalist institutions are no different from the Catholic Church in the days of Galileo, using their power and influence to contain and manipulate information and to suppress anyone who challenges the hegemonic status quo, as Vietnamese human rights journalist Luong Chan made clear.
If you understand why centuries ago the Roman Catholic Church suppressed scientists because their discoveries contradicted church doctrine, you will understand why nowadays the capitalist class fiercely suppresses communist voices. They haven't just waged war against communism, they also pay vast fortunes to force their agenda through education, culture, and marketing, with the sole aim of getting people to buy into the pyramid scheme of capitalism and distorting the truth about communism. A boat is a craft used to travel on the water. Except this boat will never travel on the water again.
and this one has never traveled on the water. Are these then even boats at all? Or is the word boat simply an ideological construction that actually separates us from the real world? What am I even standing on right now if it's not a boat? Now, this might seem like a silly question, but I think it's very important to question our most basic assumptions, our ideological constructs, the way in which we experience the world, especially if we hope to change the world through political action. Theodo Adorno was a German philosopher with a Jewish father who was forced to flee Germany in 1934. In his book, Negative Dialectics, Adorno advanced several ideas which he felt updated the ideas of Marx's dialectical materialism to account for the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, and many other phenomena which Marx could not have accounted for in his time. The word boat, according to Adorno, is a symbol. It holds the content of an idea, a thought construct, a concept. Each concept applies to many different objects, to many different things. The word boat, for instance, applies to all things, all objects that are boats. But this concept of a boat, which I summon by word, is fundamentally different from the actual objects which my mind conceives of as boats. Concepts are inherently limiting, and the concepts we hold in our heads will never universally or perfectly mirror the real world objects which they represent. In other words, the things we think of as boats, we are separated from them by the very language we use, by the very word boat. That thing over there, which I call a boat, is not materially defined by the word boat. Blowing your mind yet? Yet, whenever we humans realize that some concept we hold is inaccurate or incomplete, we will always try to improve that concept and our understanding of the real world to make the concept more perfect and more accurate. As Marx and Engels indicated, we are always striving to make our ideology more closely aligned with reality, even if we know that that work will never truly be complete. This is the work of science, and it must be the work of our politics. So Adorno believed that we should always be skeptical of our own ideas, of our own concepts, and that we should recognize that harm can come from concepts which are ill-conceived. And Adorno also knew that some things simply could not be conceptualized at all. Adorno famously said, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." What this means is that in the wake of something as indescribably horrifying as the Holocaust, all of our projects and endeavors occur in the shadow of it, because we could never fully conceptualize the real true nature of something like the Holocaust, because it was just too large, too terrible, too weighty to ever grasp or comprehend as a concept. All of our efforts to communicate stand in some way in contrast to that inability to conceptualize. In Adorno's words, the feeling which after Auschwitz resists every assertion of positivity of existence as sanctimonious prattle, as injustice to the victims. Adorno was rejecting Hegel's notion that humanity is always rising higher and higher towards some absolute truth, and rejecting the notion that dialectical synthesis is always a step forward. Sometimes, according to Adorno, dialectical processes can actually move us backwards, and Auschwitz was undeniable evidence of this fact. Adorno wrote that we must change our thinking drastically so that something like Auschwitz could never happen again. Hitler has imposed a new categorical imperative upon humanity in the state of their unfreedom, to arrange their thinking and conduct so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, that nothing similar will ever happen. According to Adorno, only materialism could meet the demands of this moral imperative, and only a form of materialism which could account for the negative dialectics which he described. Auschwitz irrefutably demonstrated the failure of culture, that it could happen in the midst of all the traditions of philosophy, art, and the enlightened sciences says that in them dwells untruth. All culture after Auschwitz, including its urgent critique, is garbage. Adorno's prescription for how to think and behave after Auschwitz was to be radically self-critical. We must always strive for skepticism of our own ideology and praxis, to constantly question ourselves and our understanding, and to recognize the limitations of our concepts, and to test and challenge our own ideological positions constantly. After all, the Third Reich's Nazi philosophy was rooted in a positivist conception
of a German destiny for an ideologically constructed Aryan race, which was pseudoscientifically believed to be superior to all other races. In short, Adorno begged us to question our own ideologies, to challenge ourselves, to change the way we think so that nothing like Auschwitz could ever happen again. Jacques Derrida was another Jewish philosopher who was affected by the anti-Semitic fascism of the early 20th century. Born in 1930, as a boy in French Algeria, he was kicked out of his school by the Vichy French government for being Jewish. Derrida saw himself as a historian and originated the approach to history and philosophy which he called deconstruction. He challenged many long-standing assumptions about human history and society and made the observation that human structures and institutions cannot be understood without first understanding the histories of how they came into being. Derrida was very interested in problems which seemed to have no solution, situations in which finding a path forward was difficult or impossible, where two conflicting answers seemed to be true at the same time. And Derrida called these moments of paradoxical unsolvability aporias. Take, for example, the concept of now. Now is the time that is taking place before the future and after the past, but it is impossible for a human to truly contemplate what is happening now. If we try to contemplate a moment of now, then by the time we think of it in our brains, it has already become the past, and we're simply considering a memory of what has very, very recently occurred. Yet it's certain that now exists and that we as humans experience now in some way, given that we exist and think within the time that is now. And so there is not a simple, complete answer to the question, what is now? And that makes now a fundamentally aporetic concept. Derrida believed that aporia was a fundamental aspect of politics. According to Derrida, ethics, politics, and responsibility, if there are any, will only ever have begun with the experience and experiment of the aporia. Derrida pointed out that the foundation of any political state or institution is aporetic by nature. For example, when the United States was founded by the Declaration of Independence, it constituted an aporetic paradox because it was founded through a declarative act of itself. In other words, through what Derrida calls a coup of force, the United States is an entity which called itself into being, which breaks the very laws of causality.
So, was the Declaration of Independence simply describing an entity which already existed prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or did the signing of the Declaration of Independence bring that entity into being?
As Derrida puts it, one cannot decide, and that's the interesting thing. The force and the coup of force of such a declarative act, whether independence is stated or produced by this utterance, this obscurity, this undecidability is required in order to produce the sought-after effect. According to Derrida, in order for a state to become legitimate in the eyes of the people, this initial foundational aporia must fade away and disappear over time so that that foundation of the state is never called into question. In some cases, the aporia is just too strong and causes destruction, such as in South Africa's apartheid government, which was founded by a small white minority to oppress the black indigenous majority. Nelson Mandela was able to leverage this obvious aporia to found a new state, but even this founding was an aporetic coup of force. The aporia in political action is unavoidable. Similarly to South Africa's apartheid government, the so-called founding fathers of the USA who signed the Declaration of Independence simply declared themselves to be representatives of the United States of America, the United People of America, even though they originally only represented wealthy, landowning white people in that landmass. The aporia of this foundation, the paradoxes and self-contradictions which undermine the legitimacy of the state must be pondered if one is to make any attempt at understanding the current United States of America. You may be beginning to see now how this dovetails with Zizek's concept of ideology and Gramsci's ideas of capitalist hegemony. We're expected to take the existence of the state for granted, to view the state as an entity which should not be questioned. We should not question the formation of the state, the legitimacy of the state. That the state exists and should exist and must exist is considered common sense by most people. And so burying, concealing, forgetting this aporia of the foundation of the state is an ideological construction of capitalist hegemony. Now, this is all very relevant to us as political activists and revolutionists because such aporias have been and will be inherent to every political action and every political institution, and that's just something we got to deal with. We as socialists claim to speak for and work on behalf of the proletariat, don't we? We hope to eventually declare an independent and free society into existence, but this institution of a new society will come by necessity through a coup of force. We will have to acknowledge and confront these and other aporias which we ourselves will manifest into existence if our revolution is ever successful.
For Derrida, aporias are not inherently bad, they are simply unavoidable. Discovering aporias that are rooted in our social, cultural, and political structures is fundamentally important if we want to have any hope of understanding them more deeply. Like Marx, Engels, and Adorno, Derrida did not believe humanity would ever come to an absolute or perfect understanding of reality, and aporias are a big reason why.
Derrida knew that we could not simply negate or extinguish all aporias from existence. We must indeed find ways to exist through aporias and try our best to understand them as completely as possible through deconstructive analysis. So, what to make of all this? If it's true, as Adorno submitted, that positive dialectical progress is not inevitable, that humanity has no predestined path, and that we can indeed slip backwards, if it's true, as Derrida says, that some unsolvable aporetic quandaries surround us, if it's true, as Zizek and Lacan point out, that we can never fully free ourselves from the restraints of our ideology and language to access a direct and fully accurate perception of reality, what are we to do? Admitting that these kinds of constraints and barriers to our understanding may exist, and indeed aggressively seeking them out, is not the same as admitting defeat in the face of the unknown and the unknowable. On the contrary, it should make us hopeful that we can achieve a better and deeper understanding of ourselves and our reality. Knowing that there is always more that we can learn and understand should excite us and inspire us to do just that, to constantly challenge ourselves and our own ideas in search of deeper truth. Epistemology and ontology, materialist dialectics and deconstruction, and aporia, these are all tools we can use to advance our understanding of reality and to advance our movement politically. With these tools, we can seek out contradictions between our ideology and the material world, find the inherent contradictions and paradoxes that permeate our own ideology, and hopefully liberate ourselves and others from false consciousness. We have to admit to ourselves that we observe this game of chess that is reality, not from the top-down perspective of a player with a complete view of the board and a comprehensive understanding of the rules, but rather from the perspective of a single piece. And we have to try to work out our own understanding of our role in this magnificent game for ourselves. We must know that what may appear to be a sturdy and sound vessel of ideology carrying us across the sea of reality may indeed be little more than grounded wreckage, which we must deconstruct and carefully reassemble if we ever hope to reach our destination. Damn, I wrote the shit out of that line. Now, I know these ideas seem probably complicated if you're not familiar with them. They probably seem esoteric, maybe even useless. But epistemology and ontology, materialist dialectics, and deconstruction and aporia, these are all tools we can use to advance our understanding of reality and to advance ourselves politically. With these tools, with this understanding of ideology and the ways in which our minds and reality function, we can seek out contradictions between our ideology and the material world. We can see the inherent contradictions and paradoxes that permeate our own ideologies, and we can hopefully liberate ourselves and others from false consciousness. Honestly, we're barely even scratching the surface on these ideas, and I, of course, had to make some gross simplifications and generalizations to fit all of this into a reasonably short and easy to follow video, but I hope you've at least gotten a glimpse at why these philosophical issues matter for political activists, and I hope it will inspire you to study more. It's important to understand why we believe the things we believe, how we come to know things, and whether or not our ideological positions reflect material reality. In a future video, we'll take a look at existentialism and how a lack of any preordained human destiny should guide us towards anarchism, to the deconstruction of hierarchy, and why negating the contradictions of the state and capitalism would be cool and awesome. If you want to learn more about these topics, there are plenty of links in the description below, and feel free to deconstruct me and this video in the comments. I'm American Johnson, or am I? This is non-compete, or is it? And we're sitting here on a boat in Hoi An, Vietnam, or are we? Anyway, thanks for watching.
Put your hands up. Come forward. Forward, 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 forward. Forward. Stop. Back a little bit.